It begins not with a discovery, but with a silence. In the age of satellites and live streams, silence is rare. Every movement in orbit is tracked, every word transmitted, every image archived. And yet, again and again, there are moments when the record falters. A signal drops. A camera turns away. A transcript skips a few minutes that never quite return. These gaps are small, often dismissed as technical errors. But taken together, they form a pattern, one that invites a quieter, more unsettling question. What happens when those trained to observe the universe see something that does not fit the story we tell ourselves? For more than half a century, astronauts and cosmonauts have carried human curiosity beyond Earth's atmosphere. They have been engineers, pilots, scientists, men and women selected not for imagination, but for discipline. Their job was not to wonder, but to report, to describe what was there and only what was there. And yet, scattered through the history of spaceflight are hints that some observations were treated differently. Not denied outright, simply set aside. This story is not about certainty. It is about testimony, memory, and the tension between experience and explanation. It is about how institutions respond when confronted with ambiguity, and how individuals live with knowledge they are asked not to share. In December 1972, the last humans to walk on the moon moved through a valley older than life on Earth. Their voices crackled calmly across the void, naming rocks, measuring shadows. Then, without warning, the channel went quiet. 11 minutes passed with no public record of what was said. When communication resumed, the mission continued as planned. Officially, nothing unusual occurred. Years later, fragments surfaced. A tone of surprise, a reference to geometry that seemed out of place. 13 photographs missing from an otherwise complete archive. Each anomaly on its own could be explained away. Together, they raised a different possibility, not of hidden truths, but of unspoken ones. Across the world, aboard a Soviet space station in the 1980s, cosmonauts described a light that flooded their orbit. Shapes outside the window. A shared vision witnessed by multiple crew members across different missions. The official response was swift: medical evaluations, classified files, silence. Decades later, with the Cold War over, a few voices cautiously re-emerged. Not with answers, but with questions that had never left them. Back on Earth, retired astronauts spoke carefully, choosing words that circled their meaning without landing. Interesting phenomena, things we're still trying to understand, observations that didn't make it into the final report. Their restraint was striking, not because they sounded fearful, but because they sounded practiced. What unites these moments is not proof, but response. Extended debriefings, missing footage, protocols activated without explanation. The language of national security applied not to weapons or borders, but to sight lines and reflections in space. It is tempting to frame these stories as revelations, to push them toward spectacle. But that impulse misses something more human. At their core, these accounts are about people encountering the limits of their frameworks and being asked to carry that weight quietly. Science advances by asking better questions. History advances by revisiting old ones. Somewhere between the two lies this unresolved space, not a secret waiting to be exposed, but a mystery waiting to be understood. As we begin this journey, the question is not what was seen, but why the silence that followed mattered so much, and what it means, even now, to look up at the night sky knowing that some stories remain unfinished. It started with a glint, a flicker of light on the lunar horizon. Apollo 17's final moonwalk in December 1972 was supposed to be routine. Commander Eugene Cernan and geologist Harrison Schmitt were collecting rock samples in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, their voices steady, professional, as they narrated each movement for mission control. Then Schmitt paused. "There's something reflecting light on the crater rim. I'm going to investigate." That sentence is in the official record. What follows is not. For the next 11 minutes, all communication between Apollo 17 and Houston ceased. Silence returned to the Moon. Years later, audio technicians working on restoration projects unearthed fragments from that blackout. They heard Schmidt's voice again, calmer than it should have been, given what he said. "This is artificial, Gene. Look at the geometry. This isn't a natural formation." And Cernan, audibly shaken, "Houston, we need guidance on this. Over." What guidance came, if any, is unknown. The mission resumed. The astronauts returned home. No explanation was ever offered for the missing transmission or the discrepancy in the photographic record. 13 frames from Schmidt's camera, absent from NASA's archives, precisely aligning with the duration of the blackout. NASA's official position? The images were overexposed, unusable. Yet every other overexposed photo from Apollo missions remains in the archive, labeled and preserved. These were not. Years later, Cernan gave one interview that brushed against the edge of disclosure. "We saw things up there," he said, "that were matters of national security." He didn't elaborate. He simply added, "The universe is full of surprises. Some of them are very close to home." Schmidt, the geologist, was more guarded. He spoke occasionally of unusual formations that defied conventional explanation. Formations, he implied, that didn't belong on a geologically dead world like the Moon, but he never directly addressed what happened that day. Former NASA staff, speaking anonymously, revealed that Schmidt's post-mission debriefing lasted nearly 2 weeks, far longer than the standard 3 days. He was kept in isolation, questioned by officials outside the normal protocol. Something had changed. Then came the fire. In 1976, 4 years after Apollo 17, a fire broke out in a NASA storage facility. It destroyed the only unedited film reels of the mission's surface operations. The fire occurred in a temperature-controlled, fire-suppressed vault that had never experienced such an event. It was never publicly investigated. It was simply noted. The final Moon mission left more questions than answers. Why were trained astronauts, scientists, engineers, suddenly encountering anomalies in the most documented exploration in human history? Why did those anomalies result not in further inquiry, but in silence and redaction? Maybe what they saw didn't fit the narrative of a barren, lifeless moon. Maybe it challenged assumptions too deeply rooted in Cold War certainty and institutional pride. Or maybe it was simply too strange to explain. Cernan passed away in 2017. Schmidt remains one of the last living moonwalkers. Neither man ever retracted what little they hinted. And NASA? It moved forward, the gaps in the record left unaddressed. But the question persists, as steady and quiet as lunar dust. What did they see on the Moon's final walk? Perhaps more importantly, why have we never gone back? The Moon remains silent, waiting. Its valleys hold secrets beneath 1,000 nights of shadow. And maybe, just maybe, some of those secrets looked back at the last men to stand there, asking the same question from the other side of history. What are you doing here? July 1984. A glow unlike any dawn spilled across the Saljut 7 space station. Inside, Soviet cosmonauts Leonid Kizim, Vladimir Solovyov, and Oleg Atkov were going about their routines, measuring oxygen levels, adjusting solar arrays, documenting Earth's curvature. Then came the light. Orange, warm, and inexplicable. It surrounded the station, penetrated metal, bathed them in something that felt alive. Drawn to the port window, they looked out and froze. 7 colossal figures hovered outside, humanoid in shape, ethereal in presence. Each was over 80 feet tall, with wings that shimmered like molten glass and halos that pulsed with a kind of energy no human had ever seen. The beings did not drift. They held formation, moving in harmony with the orbiting station. For 10 full minutes, they remained. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, They were gone. The cosmonauts radioed mission control immediately. What followed was swift and clinical. They were ordered to undergo psychological evaluation. All records of the event were classified. The Soviet government issued no statement, and no official documentation was released. 12 days later, 3 more cosmonauts arrived at Saljut 7. On their second day aboard, the light returned. This time, all 6 crew members witnessed it. This time, they had cameras ready. They captured images, blurry but unmistakable, of the figures outside. Those photographs were immediately seized upon return. The cosmonauts were silenced, warned under penalty of prosecution. The images were classified top secret, locked away as artifacts of state secrecy. Years passed. The USSR collapsed. Solovyov eventually spoke, cautiously. "We saw them, all 6 of us. These weren't hallucinations. We were trained observers. What we witnessed was real, physical, and impossible to explain." Kazim later shared that Soviet scientists considered theories, plasma-based life forms, interdimensional beings, or perhaps advanced surveillance technology from some unknown origin. But nothing accounted for the beings' size, their movement, or their clear awareness of the station. According to a source within Soviet intelligence, the photos revealed entities that seemed to straddle the boundary between matter and energy, glowing forms that radiated intention. More unsettling, Saljut 7 was not the only station to report such sightings. Earlier Saljut missions, later Mir expeditions. Always the same pattern: light, presence, silence. No official report, no admission, just gaps in the record and the haunted expressions of those who returned. What were they? Guardians? Projections? Something older than our understanding of physics or consciousness? Perhaps they were never meant to be observed at all. The Saljut 7 incident remains one of the most compelling and eerie moments in space exploration. Not because of what was said, but because of who said it, and how consistently their testimonies align, even decades later, even under threat of silence. We assume space is empty, cold, silent, waiting to be filled with our ambitions. But what if it isn't? What if something is already there, not indifferent, but observant? And what if those 7 figures, luminous and unexplainable, were not a visitation, but a reminder that even in the vast silence of orbit, we are not alone. We have never been. We just weren't supposed to know it yet. 1957, Edwards Air Force Base. The desert air was dry and still, perfect for test flights. But that day, something entirely different descended, quiet, deliberate, undeniable. Gordon Cooper wasn't an astronaut yet. He was a test pilot, managing experimental aircraft evaluations, sharp-eyed and grounded in engineering logic. That morning, his team was filming standard runway tests when a metallic object appeared over the dry lake bed. Disc-shaped, smooth, silent. It descended slowly, extended landing gear like something designed with purpose, touched the Earth for just moments, then lifted off with a velocity that defied explanation. The entire encounter was caught on high-resolution military cameras. Cooper reviewed the footage himself, frame by frame. There was no question. The craft was not a known aircraft, not a malfunctioning drone, not debris. It was something else. He followed protocol, packaging the film and sending it to Washington. It was never returned. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a quiet order. Do not speak of this again. Cooper followed that order for decades, until the end. In 2004, on his deathbed, weakened by Parkinson's but lucid, Gordon Cooper finally spoke. He revealed the event at Edwards, the missing footage, and something more. During his 1963 Mercury Atlas 9 mission, America's final solo orbital flight, Cooper encountered another anomaly. On his last orbit, a glowing green object approached his capsule, pacing him silently. It held formation for minutes. ground radar in Australia confirmed an unidentified object tracking with Cooper's spacecraft. After landing, he was told it would not appear in the official report. The radar data was classified. The Australian team was instructed to remain silent. Cooper lived with that knowledge, confined by layers of secrecy, for over 40 years. In his final interview, he was clear. Every day in the USA, our radar instruments capture objects of form and composition unknown to us. There are thousands of documents, but nobody wants to make them public. He revealed an internal protocol, debriefings that included questions about unusual observations, with responses directed into sealed reports, never to reach the public domain. Later, during his time as a UN advisor, Cooper attempted to form a task force to study these encounters scientifically. His proposal was blocked. The reason? Releasing the information would, in their words, reveal things the public is not ready to know. Cooper's confession was not dramatic. It was solemn, measured. A man with nothing left to lose, no reputation to protect, offering what he believed the world needed to hear. He died days later, taking the rest of the details with him. What he left behind was more than testimony. It was a pattern, credible observers, silent records, knowledge channeled into vaults instead of journals. And the most haunting question, why? What was so significant about these objects, these moments, that institutions chose silence over science? Cooper didn't ask for belief. He asked for curiosity, for openness, for the idea that maybe, just maybe, the universe has been trying to show us something, and we've refused to look. In a desert sky in 1957, in orbit in 1963, something approached, and someone decided we weren't ready to know it. It was meant to be a quiet mission, a spacewalk, some routine photographs, then home. June 3, 1965, Gemini 4. Astronaut James McDivitt orbited Earth, alone with his thoughts and the whirring cadence of onboard systems. He had been scanning the vast black outside when something appeared, a shape that did not belong. He described it as cylindrical, with arms protruding outward, a form both unfamiliar and unmistakably structured. It moved with intent, not drifting like debris, but controlling its position in relation to the capsule. Close enough that he could see details, contours, elements no lens flare could imitate. McDivitt did what any pilot would do. He grabbed a camera, snapped multiple frames. He radioed Houston, "I have an unidentified object in sight. It appears to be artificial. It's maneuvering, attempting to photograph." That message made it to Earth, but what followed did not. McDivitt's debriefing upon return was unusual. It was long, tense, attended by intelligence officials he didn't recognize. The photographs were taken from him immediately. When they were eventually released years later, they showed only hazy smears, dismissed as lens anomalies. But McDivitt never accepted that. "I know what I saw," he said. "It was a craft. It wasn't a star. It wasn't debris. It was made." In interviews over the decades, he never wavered. Not once. Unlike others who softened their language, McDivitt remained adamant. His memory was clear. The object was deliberate. And NASA had the images to prove it, at least before they vanished into classification. Technicians from that mission would later leak that the original photos showed a structured object with lines and mechanical features. Those images were never part of the public record. Why? Perhaps because admitting the existence of such an object, something intelligent, maneuvering in Earth's orbit, would demand questions no one at the time was ready to answer. And yet, McDivitt kept asking. He spoke calmly, without sensationalism. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was honoring what he saw. Until his death in 2022, he carried that truth, unanswered, unexplained. His case remains one of the most compelling in the early days of spaceflight, not because of evidence alone, but because of his integrity. A man with nothing to gain, pressing a question that science kept dodging. Why pretend nothing happened? We often think of astronauts as explorers of distance, but what McDivitt discovered wasn't a far-off planet. It was the boundary between knowledge and denial. And in that moment, alone in the capsule, camera in hand, he crossed it. What do we do with testimony that won't fade? Maybe the more important question is, what do we lose when we ignore it? In the age of live streams and public transparency, it happened again, only this time, millions were watching. A year into Commander Scott Kelly's record-setting mission aboard the International Space Station, a routine public broadcast was underway. Kelly, accompanied by Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Kornienko, was offering a guided tour of the station, joking, explaining, floating gently through modules. Then, in mid-sentence, he stopped. He drifted toward a window, paused, and said calmly, "Houston, we have something in visual range that's not on the manifest. Multiple objects, holding position relative to the station." The screen went black. NASA's Public Affairs Office cited a technical glitch, but it wasn't just a glitch. The feed remained offline for more than 3 hours, an eternity by ISS standards. During that time, no updates were issued, no statements made. Even automatic telemetry feeds went silent. When the stream resumed, the camera angles had changed. No one spoke of what had just occurred. Not Kelly. Not NASA. Nothing. But behind the scenes, something serious had unfolded. Leaked accounts from mission control personnel later revealed what Kelly had seen: multiple metallic, disc-shaped objects. They were outside the station, hovering in formation, maintaining a precise and unnatural distance. The objects reflected sunlight in a way that suggested mass, design, intent. NASA immediately triggered a rarely acknowledged contingency, the blackout protocol. It involves cutting all public communications, rerouting all transmissions to secure military channels, and alerting NORAD and Space Command. During these events, the ISS becomes a silent island, encircled by unseen observers. While the world saw nothing, the crew aboard ISS was ordered to observe, document, and transmit only through encrypted systems. External cameras were remotely repositioned to capture the encounter from multiple angles. That footage exists, but it has never been released. Kelly's return to Earth in March 2016 was celebrated publicly. But privately, his debriefings stretched for weeks, far longer than standard. Military officials were present. His brother, astronaut and now U.S. Senator Mark Kelly, attended some of those closed-door sessions. Neither has ever spoken about what was discussed. In a rare unguarded moment at a private 2018 event, Scott Kelly reportedly said, "What we see up there would fundamentally change how people think about Earth's place in the universe." That wasn't on camera, but it was remembered. In 2019, through a Freedom of Information Act request, fragments of internal NASA documentation surfaced. They confirmed the existence of the blackout protocol and revealed it had been triggered at least 7 times since 2010, each time in response to objects exhibiting intelligent flight patterns near the ISS. These weren't accidents. They weren't debris. They were encounters. James Oberg, a former NASA mission controller, confirmed the protocol's existence. "There are procedures," he said. "They're rarely needed, but when they are, they're followed exactly, and always for something serious." Why keep this hidden? Perhaps to prevent panic. Perhaps because acknowledging such incidents would open doors that institutions can't control. Or perhaps because, somewhere in orbit, something else is watching, and someone decided the world isn't ready to look back. What did Scott Kelly see? More to the point, what is it about that sighting, and those like it, that demand silence? The sky above us is not empty, and every so often a window opens. For 3 hours in 2015, the world looked away. NASA didn't. Sometimes revelation doesn't arrive in orbit. It arrives in reflection. Dr. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, wasn't just the sixth man to walk on the moon. He was the first to return profoundly changed by what he felt on the way home. During the 3-day voyage back to Earth in 1971, Mitchell experienced something he could not name: a sense of unity, a deep awareness that consciousness was not confined to biology, that it might be a fundamental force in the universe itself. It was more than awe. It was a shift. He spent the rest of his life trying to understand it. With a doctorate from MIT and a military background, Mitchell was the definition of credibility. Yet he began speaking openly about phenomena others only whispered about: telepathy, quantum consciousness, unexplained aerial encounters. His views were met with polite dismissal. But Mitchell remained calm, reasoned, determined. He wasn't interested in sensationalism. He was interested in truth. Over the years, Mitchell quietly built relationships with government insiders, retired military, intelligence officers, aerospace engineers, people with stories to tell and nowhere to tell them. From them, he heard the same refrain: "We are not alone, and someone has been hiding that fact for a long time." In interviews, he hinted. Then, in 2008, he stopped hinting. "I happen to have been privileged enough to be in on the fact that we've been visited on this planet," he said in a radio interview. "And the UFO phenomenon is real. It's been well covered up by all our governments for the last 60 years. He spoke of Roswell not as myth but as event, of recovered technology, of off-the-record briefings, and of a system built not to inform but to contain. Mitchell didn't claim to have seen spacecraft himself, but he made it clear. Other astronauts had. Some, he said, were explicitly warned not to speak. Others were debriefed in ways that ensured silence, sometimes through pressure, sometimes through fear. In private congressional briefings near the end of his life, Mitchell presented evidence: documents, witness testimony, names, dates. What was discussed remains sealed. But those in the room later said his case was compelling. And he didn't stop there. Mitchell described anomalies during Apollo missions that were never made public: surveillance from above, objects pacing spacecraft, moments on the lunar surface that were excised from the record. He believed humanity stood on the edge of something enormous, not just technological discovery, but philosophical awakening. He warned that continued denial was not only dishonest, but dangerous. "If contact becomes open," he said, "we need to be ready. Pretending it isn't happening won't protect us. It will only keep us blind." NASA distanced itself. Officials issued statements emphasizing Mitchell spoke only for himself. But what stands out is that he never recanted, never wavered. Until his death in 2016, he spoke with quiet urgency, hoping his words would outlive the silence. What makes Mitchell different is not just what he said, but how he said it. Not to shock, to prepare. He saw the moon. But what changed him was the space between here and there, the place where questions echo and answers are feared. He believed consciousness connects everything, and that hiding the truth fractures that connection. In his final interviews, Mitchell asked only this: "Are we willing to expand our understanding of reality? Or will we continue to deny what's right in front of us, simply because it doesn't fit what we've been told?" It's not the moon that changed him. It's what he saw on the way home. February 25, 1996. The Space Shuttle Columbia drifted silently above Earth, deploying one of the most ambitious experiments of its era, the Tethered Satellite System, or TSS-1R. A 12-mile-long conductive cable meant to generate electricity through interaction with Earth's magnetic field extended gracefully into space. The experiment was elegant in design, rich with promise. Then the tether snapped. It broke clean, unexpectedly, and floated away. NASA's cameras followed it as it tumbled, silver and serpentine, into the dark. But it wasn't the broken tether that made this mission unforgettable. It was what appeared around it. As the tether moved away from Colombia, the live video feed, broadcast on NASA Select TV, captured dozens, then hundreds of luminous disc-shaped objects swarming around it. They varied in size, but many appeared massive, miles wide if the tether's length was used to scale. The objects pulsed with light, moved independently, passed behind the tether, showing depth and dimensionality. Astronauts aboard Columbia could be heard remarking, "They're very distinct. They're moving at different velocities." Viewers around the world recorded the broadcast before NASA abruptly cut the feed. The official explanation was swift: ice particles, debris, camera focus issues, optical illusions. But something didn't add up. The objects weren't uniformly shaped. Many had notched or irregular edges. They rotated, changed direction, behaved in ways inconsistent with drifting particles. Some appeared to respond to the tether's movement, as if interacting with it or drawn to it. Independent analysts studied the footage. One, image specialist Mark Carl, concluded the objects displayed characteristics that strongly suggest intelligent control and distant scale. If the objects were truly behind the tether, as the footage implies, they were enormous and far too dynamic to be debris. Dr. Jack Kasher, a physicist, took it further. His orbital mechanics analysis demonstrated that if the objects were close to the camera, their observed behavior would violate known physical laws. The only plausible interpretation: they were distant, large, and moving independently of any known mechanism. NASA stood firm in its position. The footage was archived. The discussion faded, but those images never disappeared. They remain online, studied, dissected, re-watched by those unwilling to accept the ice particle theory. What makes the tether incident so unusual is the sheer quantity and quality of evidence. No eyewitness ambiguity, no fleeting glimpse. This was sustained, high-resolution documentation, witnessed in real time by ground control, the crew, and the public. Yet no official inquiry followed. Why? Was it the nature of the experiment, high-voltage electricity stretching into the void, that drew these objects? Or was it coincidence? More haunting is the idea that these entities, whatever they are, have been there all along, watching, invisible until something like the tether revealed their presence. A momentary tear in the veil. The footage still exists. The questions still echo. What if the most revealing moment in spaceflight didn't happen on the Moon or Mars, but in the quiet, unplanned drift of a snapped tether? And what if what we saw then was not the anomaly, but the constant we've refused to see? It was a single question that changed everything. Did you see evidence on the Moon that suggested previous visitation by non-human intelligence? Buzz Aldrin's answer was simple: yes. In 2018, decades after the Apollo 11 mission, the second man to walk on the Moon sat for a polygraph test, part of a study on memory and truth under stress. The questions were direct, the stakes high, and the results left little room for ambiguity. According to the analysis, Aldrin believed what he said. No signs of deception, no hesitation. Just a quiet affirmation of something he had carried for nearly 50 years. Publicly, Aldrin has always walked a careful line. In interviews, he described seeing an object during the Apollo 11 mission that followed their spacecraft. He suggested it might have been part of the spacecraft's own structure, a detached panel perhaps. NASA accepted this explanation. So did the press. But the polygraph painted a different picture. When asked whether the object demonstrated controlled flight, Aldrin said yes, and believed it. When asked whether he had been instructed not to speak about the full encounter, he again said yes, with complete truthfulness. And when asked whether there were photographs taken on the moon that showed evidence of previous visitation, Aldrin affirmed it once more. The stress indicators were clear, not of lying, but of someone burdened by secrets too long held. Aldrin never publicly elaborated, but in quieter moments he dropped hints. "There are some interesting things I'm not at liberty to discuss in this forum," he once wrote in a 20 public Q&A. "Some things remain private because that's what we were told they had to be." He wasn't the only one. Apollo astronaut Alan Bean said something similar in 2015. "If we had seen something truly extraordinary up there, would we be allowed to tell you? That's the question you should be asking." The protocols were real. Debriefings after lunar missions included classified components. There were rules, spoken and unspoken, about what could be said, and the consequences for breaking them? Severe: loss of pension, reputation, career. In later interviews, Aldrin became more philosophical, almost poetic. "There are always things that remain private, and some things remain private because the reasons they were private haven't changed." That quiet sentence spoke volumes. This wasn't about wild theories or conspiracies. This was about experience, observations made by highly trained individuals under extraordinary conditions, bound by agreements that stretched beyond mission completion and into the rest of their lives. Why would such restrictions be necessary? What could be on the moon, on our first visit to another world, that justified not just secrecy, but silence? The answer may lie not in what was seen, but in how it would change us. If evidence exists, evidence of prior activity, structures, or presence, it would reshape history, science, and belief in one stroke. Institutions are rarely eager for that kind of upheaval, and so silence endures. The polygraph remains one of the few objective signals we have, a needle tracing the pulse of memory under pressure. And in Aldrin's case, it drew a clear, steady line. He saw something, and for reasons he never chose, he could never say what. Perhaps the most telling truth is not what Buzz Aldrin revealed. It's how much he didn't. And still, the weight of what he knows clings to his words like lunar dust, fine, silent, inescapable. Some secrets are buried in vaults, others in memories, left smoldering in the minds of those who witnessed too much. In 2019, a former Soviet aerospace engineer named Viktor Afanasyev stepped forward with a story he had been carrying since the Cold War. He had worked deep within the Soviet space program, managing flight protocols, reviewing telemetry, monitoring cosmonaut reports. But behind the official mission logs, he said, was another archive. It was called Special Event Documentation. Whenever a cosmonaut observed something unexplained, objects in orbit, lights that followed, systems that failed without cause, they were instructed to file a separate report. Not in the public log, not to mission control, but through secure channels, classified and reviewed by KGB-cleared personnel only. Afanasyev said he read them all. One stood out, a 1978 Soyuz mission. Cosmonaut Vladimir Kovalyonok reported a glowing sphere that paced his spacecraft for several minutes. It appeared to scan the hull, then accelerated away in a motion beyond any known propulsion system. Kovalyonok described it as intelligent, probing, aware. Then came the 1982 incident. A disc-shaped object appeared near another Soyuz capsule, seemingly interfering with its onboard computer. Systems failed, then returned as soon as the object left. Most haunting were the reports from spacewalks. One cosmonaut in 1991 described seeing a large object emerge from Earth's shadow, hovering silently, soipoli, close enough to make out surface features, windows, lights, purpose. He was ordered back inside immediately. Psychological evaluation followed. None of these incidents made it into public records. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the archive was scattered. Some files were destroyed, others absorbed by Roscosmos or passed to intelligence agencies. But Afanasiev claimed to have saved copies, documents that listed dates, mission numbers, and the names of those who saw what should not have been there. Verification has proven difficult. Russian freedom of information laws offer little access, but others have stepped forward to corroborate his claims. Marina Popovich, a Soviet test pilot and engineer, stated that debriefings often included questions about unusual observations, and that cosmonauts were warned not to speak publicly. Georgy Grechko, another veteran cosmonaut, said simply, "There were things we weren't allowed to talk about. That's all I can say." Why the silence? Perhaps the Soviet government feared the same thing as the United States. That disclosure would disrupt control over the public, over science, over the story of who we are. Or perhaps, behind closed doors, the two spacefaring rivals were less adversaries than collaborators, bound by a mutual understanding that some knowledge crosses a line between exploration and exposure, between what we discover and what we decide to hide. Afanasiev's testimony may never be officially validated, but the patterns are familiar: sightings during mission operations, classification of reports, extended debriefings, the same institutional reflex to conceal, to reframe, to forget. What if the greatest Cold War secret wasn't a weapon or a technology, but a presence? One both sides encountered, and neither dared explain. It raises a chilling possibility. Not that the world's space agencies have been lying, but that they've been protecting something they don't fully understand. And in that gap, in that not knowing, a policy was born. Silence is safer than truth, especially when truth stares back through a visor and does not blink. March 2022. A routine cargo docking. A familiar orbit. Then a void of information longer than any in recent space history. For 7 hours, the International Space Station went dark. No public updates, no live feeds, no telemetry for amateur trackers. NASA and Roscosmos, despite geopolitical tensions at their highest in decades, issued the same explanation: a routine software update. But what followed was anything but routine. The incident began as Progress, a Russian resupply vehicle, approached the ISS. All appeared normal until crew members reportedly observed something else approaching, something not part of the manifest, something not on any tracking system. An object held station near the ISS. It wasn't debris, it wasn't a satellite. According to internal leaks, it exhibited controlled flight, adjusting its position with a precision that suggested intent. The blackout protocol was activated. For 7 hours, all external communications from the ISS were shut down. Internal feeds rerouted to encrypted military channels. NORAD and U.S. Space Command were alerted. Russian Space Forces, too. Despite the war unfolding on Earth, cooperation in orbit resumed instantly without hesitation. Something had entered the shared domain of space, and whatever it was, both nations knew exactly what to do. When transmissions resumed, the incident was erased. Crew members said nothing. Commander Thomas Marshburn, a seasoned astronaut and physician, gave no interviews. Upon returning to Earth 2 months later, his debriefing lasted over 3 weeks. He retired soon after, without explanation. ESA astronaut Matthias Maurer, also aboard at the time, was asked about the blackout. His response was measured. "There are situations in space that fall under international security protocols. I'm not authorized to discuss them." Amateur satellite watchers, meanwhile, reported unusual radio traffic. Frequencies typically used for classified operations became active. Orbital tracking anomalies appeared, brief blips, changes in the station's data signature, unexplained vector shifts. Then came the policy change. In August 2022, NASA updated its astronaut communication guidelines. The revision was subtle but unprecedented. All observations of unidentified objects or phenomena must be routed through secure channels. Public discussion without authorization is prohibited. The wording was clinical. The intent was not. This was not the first blackout, but it was the longest. And the response, the timing, the silence, suggested something beyond standard procedure. What was seen? No images have surfaced. No statements have been made. But within the space community, a quiet urgency has grown. Multiple astronauts were rotated off the ISS ahead of schedule. Their replacements underwent additional briefings, sessions described by one source as training for contingencies not in the manual. The implications are chilling. That even now, in the era of privatized spaceflight and near-constant surveillance, there remain moments where human observation meets the unknown and is swiftly, efficiently buried. The 2022 incident may be the most heavily veiled to date, but it fits the pattern. Objects observed, controlled movement, crew debriefed, public blackouts, institutional silence. And always the same unspoken agreement: better not to ask, not because there's nothing to find, but because we already have. And we still don't know what to call it. 10 cases, 10 stories, and yet they form something more than isolated anomalies. Together, they sketch a pattern. From the first Mercury missions to the sprawling architecture of the ISS, astronauts and cosmonauts, trained, rational, precise, have reported seeing what was not supposed to be there. Glowing orbs, structured craft, vast silent figures, objects that defy propulsion, mass, or explanation. Not imagined, not dreamed, documented, transmitted, and then classified. There's the silence of space, and then there's the silence that follows these events, a procedural quiet. A blackout not of malfunction, but of intent. Consider what links them: the 11-minute gap in Apollo 17 communications, the luminous beings outside Saljut 7, Gordon Cooper's confiscated footage, McDivitt's persistent testimony and altered photos, Scott Kelly's off-record warning that we're not alone, Edgar Mitchell's lifelong campaign to break the silence, Buzz Aldrin's quiet polygraph confessions, the Colombia tether footage, seen, recorded, then dismissed, Viktor Afanasyev's forbidden Soviet archives, and the long, long night of March 2022 aboard the ISS. In each case, we find the observer, credible, trained, direct; the observation, detailed, physical, unexplainable; and the response, silence, redirection, suppression. NASA, Roscosmos, intelligence agencies, protocols crafted not to explore the unknown, but to contain it. Across decades and continents, a strange consistency emerges. Astronauts returning from missions undergo extended debriefings, some isolated for weeks. Photos vanish or are replaced. Official statements dance carefully around the edges of truth. Those who speak out later in life, when careers and pensions are no longer leverage, do so with a haunted clarity. They do not sound like conspiracy theorists. They sound like people finally releasing a pressure long held inside. And still the public conversation lags behind. Dismissal comes easy. It's safer to treat these stories as footnotes or science fiction than to confront what they might mean. Why? Because if we accept that these accounts are truthful, we must also accept something larger. That we are being observed. That some intelligence, unknown, unclaimed, shares our sky. That our institutions, faced with this reality, chose containment over confrontation. The decision may not have been malicious. Perhaps it was made out of caution, perhaps even out of fear. But the consequence has been the same: a public kept in the dark, while a handful of individuals carried the weight of unspoken truths. And those truths are not easy ones. They speak to a cosmos more alive, more complex than our textbooks ever imagined. They suggest that space is not a void waiting to be filled, but a medium already inhabited. And most profoundly, they confront us with the question no official agency wants to ask. If they are here, who are they? And what do they want? In the face of such questions, silence may feel like control, but it is not safety. The truth, as these astronauts hint again and again, has always been just beyond the radio static, just behind the camera lens. Waiting. And as we move deeper into space, toward Mars, toward permanent presence beyond Earth, we will meet that truth again. The only question is, will we finally listen? Some truths don't arrive with fanfare. They arrive quietly, through the cumulative weight of testimony. Over 6 decades of spaceflight, a consistent rhythm has emerged: observation, suppression, reflection. The people at the heart of these stories aren't theorists or outsiders. They are astronauts, engineers, military pilots, calm under pressure, selected for their ability to remain rational in the face of the extraordinary. And yet, when faced with the truly inexplicable, their words become careful, conditional, bound by a language designed not to reveal, but to endure. Many of them never spoke publicly. Some waited decades. A few, like Edgar Mitchell or Gordon Cooper, chose their final years to open the sealed box inside their minds. Others, like Buzz Aldrin, simply hinted, tracing the edge of the truth without crossing the line that might cost everything. Still others are silent by necessity, not choice. There are protocols, oaths signed, pensions tied to silence, briefings that extend beyond retirement. Astronauts are not just explorers. They are ambassadors of institutional narrative. And sometimes that narrative has no room for what they've seen. Photographs vanish. Transcripts are redacted. Feeds cut. Recordings overwritten. But memory does not obey those protocols. That's why their stories matter. Not because they provide proof beyond doubt, but because they reveal the cost of certainty. What's more important than the objects described, the glowing spheres, the silent craft, the winged figures, is the human response to them. A moment of hesitation in a voice, a photograph that doesn't reappear, a public figure who suddenly retires. Each is a thread in a tapestry of controlled knowledge, carefully managed, quietly suppressed. But as these voices accumulate, a kind of soft rebellion begins, not loud, not coordinated, but insistent, a pattern of people choosing truth over comfort. And with every new mission, every new live stream from orbit, the margin for silence narrows. Civilian observers now track satellites in real time. Private companies launch missions. Encryption no longer guarantees invisibility. The sky is more watched than ever, and still, the phenomena persist. Encounters don't stop. They simply vanish from the public feed. Until someone, years later, steps forward with the part that was missing. And so the cycle continues. But cycles are meant to be broken. Perhaps we are nearing that moment, a time when the accumulation of quiet truths tips into a collective reckoning. Not sensational, not panicked, but honest. A time when we ask, what do these stories, these silences, these glimmers through the void really tell us? Not about aliens, not about conspiracies, but about ourselves. About how we choose to confront the unknown, and how long we're willing to pretend we haven't already met it. It ends where it began, with silence. But this time we understand what that silence holds. For 60 years, astronauts and cosmonauts have carried more than flags and instruments into orbit. They've carried questions, moments they couldn't explain, instructions they couldn't ignore, memories they couldn't share. The stories vary, different missions, different skies. But the tone is always the same. Something was seen, something not listed on flight plans, something not explained by physics or protocol. And every time, the same response: isolate, classify, move on. We call space the final frontier. But perhaps its real frontier isn't distance. It's honesty. Because these events, the objects that hovered, the light that followed, the figures that watched, demand not just scientific curiosity, but emotional courage. They challenge the idea that humanity is alone. They challenge the assumption that all progress is linear, all knowledge controlled. And they challenge the belief that silence equals safety. Now, as we prepare to return to the moon, to build cities in orbit, to step toward Mars and beyond, we carry these old questions into a new era. What are we willing to see? What are we willing to admit? And how will we treat those who speak the truth, especially when that truth is inconvenient? The testimonies in this story are not here to convince. They are here to remind that behind every debriefing is a human being. Behind every redacted page, a moment of awe or fear that deserved to be heard. And behind every blackout, a flash of something real. The universe is not empty. It never was. It is filled with signals, some of which we've caught and many we've buried. And now, as a new generation rises of explorers, of storytellers, of quiet observers looking up, they will face the same choice: to look away or to listen, to forget or to remember, to protect the silence, or to finally break it. Because perhaps the most human act is not to discover, but to share what was seen, even when we're told to forget, especially then.